So hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for spending your post-lunch coma with me. So this is a talk that I've actually given before, but I've rejiggered it a little bit for this audience, so it will have some new content. I want to talk about SRE and, in general, operational work in transition. So when I say transition, I mean the transition of a company from a startup to a more established enterprise, and what that kind of means. So first of all, when I say a startup, what do I actually mean? And for me, the definition here is that a startup is a company that is default dead, right? If you don't ship, your company goes away. You maybe have 6 months of runway. You've got to get something out, right? And what that means is that every team at a startup needs to be really focused on the very same mission. You've got to get a product out the door, and it has to be fast, right? You probably don't have fancy operational things. You don't have SRE teams. You don't have the incident reviews or SLOs or any of those things. And you really shouldn't be using the finicky, cool new technology that everyone's talking about. You don't need to design services that can scale 2 orders of magnitude. You don't need to design, and you shouldn't design, services that should be possible to operate easily for the next 5 years. If you have an SRE team or a team that you call SRE, they need to be really focused on that same ship now goal. Their job is to enable the rest of your organization to get things out the door quickly. Everyone's goal is to get to company sustainability, to profitability, before you run through all your investor money and before you collapse under your own technical debt. So for many startups, right, the goal is to get to that moment when suddenly it's all a success. Growth takes off, the rocket ship goes off, you hit hypergrowth, and you move from being that default dead to default alive. A default alive company is one where if it doesn't ship anything for a couple of years, probably still gonna be around. And when I say hypergrowth, right, we've all seen graphs that look like this. This is actually from Dataog. This is commits made to our various software repos over time. At Dataog, it's very easy to generate graphs with this shape at any company that has hit hypergrowth. You've got this very long phase of things that are very, very low. Those first data points aren't 0. They just look so low compared to the rest of the scale. And then there's this takeoff growth, this takeoff point, right? And that's your hypergrowth. If you're looking at graphs that look like that for your company, you probably hit hypergrowth. And that's great, right? That was your goal. You're successful. You've done it. But what about that tech debt, right? I mentioned that you're going to take on a lot of tech debt as a startup. You're trying to get things out very, very quickly. So what do I mean when I say tech debt? What are the kinds of things that you might have taken on in this environment where you were a startup? It can be a lot of things. It might be features that can't take 1 or 2 more orders of magnitude of traffic without falling over, right? That's a really common one. It could be things like you have a giant monolith and no API boundaries between teams, and 1,500 developers work on the same single monolith service. Nobody's quite sure who owns what. It can mean that team A over here uses Kubernetes and Envoy. Team B over here is using raw EC2 instances and hard-coded IP addresses. It probably means that a lot of basic systems engineering that I, as an SRE, would focus on are not widespread or, in fact, completely lacking. So you would see systems with things like infinite retries with no backoffs, which, if that doesn't sound terrifying to you, you are definitely not an SRE. Timeout set to 15 minutes on calls that would normally take half a second. Services that require full mesh client connections by design. Traffic sharding that's hard-coded and risky to change, right? These are all kinds of technical debt that it is very normal for a startup to have because they were quick to code. And I really, really want to emphasize that the company and the engineers who did this were right to do it. This was their way of getting off the ground. They were taking loans against their future selves in order to get to that point of company sustainability. But now we're here, right? And we have this debt burden, and we are paying interest on it. And ideally, we'd like to start to pay it down now that we have this sort of breathing room. There's other kinds of debt. There's not just the technical debt of services that aren't designed in the way that you might do them if you had more time. Historically, for example, for many startups, human time is cheaper than building and running automation. It's cheaper in the moment, right? It's much cheaper for someone to go scale up your services than to build a robot that will scale up your services. But that means, in that moment, right, in that very specific instant. But that means that you have a lot of things that aren't automated. There's a lot of manual operational work, and that's built into your system foundations everywhere. To scale up services, to change what job is processing what data, or to alter your sharding, Things like handling and blocking abusive traffic, maybe integration testing, maybe your deployments. And furthermore, because they've been doing it for a while, a lot of your engineers will perceive these manual operations as normal, as just the cost of doing business, as a thing that is right and correct. They may even think that it's safer than having automation or better than having automation. But the opportunity cost to your humans rises. The interest on that debt goes up the larger your scale. So as you have more humans and services, the number of humans going and pressing a button to upscale and the frequency with which they need to do that goes up and up and up, and that interest on your debt rises. So this becomes another kind of unsustainable debt. It's very much the idea of feeding human blood to the machines with your manual operations. It's also really common at startups that every engineer does everything, right? Startups love full stack engineers. They love engineers who can spin up cloud instances and write JavaScript, right? But what that also means with your startup legacy is that you've built a company that expects every engineer to know that entire stack from top to bottom and to be able to reason about that entire stack to get any work done, whether that's to fix problems or to go forward, right? That's things from service discovery and machine specifics, again, all the way up to how your front end works. Especially if you've got a you build it, you run it kind of mentality and a lack of uniformity, that means that every engineer has to know this very complex stack to get their job done. It's also really common to page a human for problems that are affecting a single customer or that self-resolve. Again, you've got this preference for manual operations, you've got this preference to have a human in the loop, but also when you were a startup, single customers were a lot more important. It mattered a lot that one customer was having a bad day when you were a startup, and maybe as an enterprise, it still matters that some customers are having a bad day, but one small customer having a bad day maybe isn't worth your engineer's time immediately, right? Obviously, you want to fix those. You care about all of your customers. Do you wake somebody up at 3 a.m. for it? On-call rotations can often be too small to be long-term sustainable in this environment. If you have small engineering teams that have been expected to know their entire stack, it can be really hard to onboard people onto those new on-call rotations. It can be really hard to share those on-call rotations among services. And so you may wind up with on-call rotations that only have 3 or 4 people on them. And then people are on call an unsustainable amount of their time. You have things like incidents that aren't reviewed. So we don't look at the underlying causes of our problems. We fix bugs and move on. And our systems become less stable over time as we do that. So in addition to, again, we've got our technical debt, our services that don't necessarily scale well, and we've got this sort of manual operational debt, this expectation that engineers do a lot of things by hand. And you've also got some cultural friction as a company makes the transition from a startup to an enterprise. This is a really hard time for a lot of engineers who have been working at a startup. They've been used to doing things however they want. You just kind of YOLO things into production. Things get out of your way. It's very fast to do. What's the problem, right? Process is always negative to people who really enjoy that environment because process takes longer. Examples of things that people have said to me. Being required to write and present a postmortem feels like punishment for having an outage. I just want to fix the problem, right? Not that anyone was going to punish them, not that anyone was blaming them for the outage. The act of examining their outage and writing a document about it felt like a punishment process, right? Because you're used to functioning as a startup where you can just do your job. Teams are often unaccustomed in this environment as well to thinking about global cost optimization rather than just for their own team. So a pattern that you'll see with this is an infrastructure team, for example, who build a new version of their service and don't build a migration plan for everyone and just expect that every team will take the time to migrate. And when that was 2 or 3 teams, that was fine. When it's several hundred teams, that's a very large global cost that they might not have thought about. Teams requesting those migrations are not used to thinking about those large distributed costs. And again, this can be perceived as process and as a lot of overhead on both sides, right? If you're a team who runs in a company like this on top of that infrastructure layer, the fact that you've probably got 3 or 4 migrations going on all the time, it's a lot of overhead, and it feels like a lot of process friction. Okay, so that's a lot of things that can be wrong. I'm an SRE. I think all of that stuff is bad. And now that we're not in ship or die mode, I want to fix those things, right? I would imagine that most people here would look at those things and say, we can fix them, let's do it. So for you, the intrepid SRE who's just joined a newly minted enterprise, or you, the person who's looking at these problems at your own company, here's some thoughts about how to go about fixing it. Before you do anything, please establish credibility. If you've been at the company since it was a startup, you may not need to think too much about this step. But if you've joined the company as it's made this transition to enterprise, which is a really common thing that happens, right? You have a startup, it goes into hypergrowth, it hires a huge number of people, it hires people who are more senior from some of those big name tech companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft. And now you've joined and you see all of these kinds of technical debt that aren't what you're used to, and you can see the damage that they're causing and you want to change them. Please, 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 whatever you do not say, at Google we, at Amazon we, at Microsoft we, at Twitter we, etc. Do not use that framing. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. First of all, it's an implied criticism, right? It says that your colleagues did it wrong. But second of all, why do I care, right? It worked at this very large company in a very different business context. It certainly wouldn't have worked at my new company when it was a startup. Why do you think it will work now? So as an individual, and if you have a team doing this, how do you establish that credibility? And really the most important thing to do when you're establishing credibility is to listen, right? Understand why things were built the way they are. Ask those questions. Why are we doing things this way? And it's really, really important that you do this blamelessly. And when I say blamelessly, I don't mean that you don't point fingers and say this person designed it wrong. You say, I believe this was designed the best way we could in the moment that we designed it. I need to understand what that meant and what those pressures were in order to understand how to make changes. So work from that assumption. These were the best decisions that were available to the engineers who made them. And make that really, really excruciatingly clear when you're talking to engineers about these things. If you just go to someone and you say, hey, why is this way? If you're coming from an outside company and that person's never spoken to you before, you sound like a jerk. You sound like a person who thinks it's wrong and is trying to get them to defend themselves. So some tips for how to frame that differently. Can you help me understand the context of this design? Do you know the limitations that led to this design choice? I don't understand the history of this service. Can you walk me through it? Right? Those are ways to ask those questions that do two things. First of all, they very clearly communicate that you really do just want the information, that you're not making a judgment. And second of all, they tell the person that you're asking that you know they know things that you don't, and you're trying to get that information from them. Another thing that you can do that is really helpful with establishing credibility is to take the time to actually do the work that these folks do in their day-to-day life. Join some teams, right? Actually do their job to understand what's hard about it, what's easy about it, how you could make it better, what those main pressures are for them. And frankly, don't expect to be good at it. In fact, it's kind of great if you're not. Say publicly that it's really hard and you struggled with it. It's astonishing how much credibility that will establish because now everyone hears that you believe their job is hard and that they're better at it than you. You also need to think about stakeholders that aren't engineers. You need to sell your vision of the world to management. And when I say that, what I mean is, why will doing it my way make the company more money? Or give your engineers more time to work on things? Or give you as a manager more insight into how your teams are working and what they need? What is the selling point to management of any change that I want to make? Not just how do I establish that credibility with developers. So there's going to be an infinite number of things to make an organization better. Every organization is imperfect. When we want to transition our operational model and any SRE teams from sort of startup mode to serious business mode, right, or to create an SRE team so that we have a serious business mode at all, there's going to be a couple dozen things you wish you could fix right this second. You do not have time and you do not have bandwidth to fix all couple dozen things right this second. So let's make a plan, let's do a little bit of triage here. It works well to prioritize the current pain points that engineers feel most acutely, either in satisfaction or reliability, so things like being paged a lot, or maybe both. I actually recommend focusing on engineering pain over the bottom line directly, for two reasons. One, you're still gaining credibility. You want people to see you have a track record of fixing things so that next time you tell them you want to do something, they want to get behind you because you've made their lives better. And the second reason is that engineering pain is actually an incredibly good proxy for the bottom line. If your engineers are frustrated because they can't get work done, that's money out the door. And so thinking about that engineer frustration can actually be a really great way to think about the bottom line, even if you don't directly have the metrics for it. So some examples of kinds of engineering pain to look for might be teams with unrealistic expectations on them. Your database team is being asked to provide SQL query level access to an entire company-wide database and being told they need to hit 100% uptime. Or every time a customer sends us more traffic, we have a 2-hour incident that requires a team to reshard their service manually. Those are very single engineering team kinds of problems. Or they might be small issues that relate to many teams, like standards for how quickly we need to respond to our pages very wildly, and they generate disagreements and friction between teams. Or I have to babysit my deployments for a couple of hours every time I make a change. Those are things that are small frictions that affect many, many teams. Once you have some thoughts on specific problems you'd like to address first, you want to cluster them and think about underlying causes. Rely on any expertise that you have in the SRE space, but think about things like maybe your cluster is failure is not normal to people. We don't think of failure being normal. That's 100% database uptime, or paging for every customer issue, or having to deeply investigate every bug, right? That's an example of thinking that failure is not normal. Some example clusters that you might also think about are like engineers use a particular piece of infrastructure badly, or this piece of infrastructure in our company has major stability or scaling challenges. Our default practices around engineering don't scale well. We don't deeply investigate our outages. We're missing a tool to do this important thing, right? Those kinds of clusters. Okay, so now we've made some clusters. You still will have to focus, right? You still can't solve all of them at once. So you would still have to pick one or two. But let's go ahead and fix some things. Chances are you're late to the party. The company's been in hypergrowth for a while. It's gotten a little bad out there. And that's going to be a lot of engineers who are doing wrong things, who are onboarding into this new company and learning bad habits. So how do you get ahead of this, right? You don't have enough SREs or enough operational people or enough senior engineers or whatever you're using to leverage this problem. You don't have enough of those to tell them how to do it right. So you need to think about scale, right? This is fundamentally one of the important principles of SRE, is to think about scale. How do you scale your efforts at cultural and technological change? If the problem is technological, that's actually much easier, right? You probably want to build or start using a specific piece of infrastructure or technology. Think about how you help teams migrate to it. How do you build a golden path for migration? Don't just demand that they do. And think about how you can loan your SREs to teams to help with that migration, to help with any design work that needs to be done. If the problem is cultural, that's going to be harder, right? You might need to build a process and get people to buy into it. And if you're trying to get engineers to buy into a process, you need to tell them what the process gains them. You might need to change company onboarding. Maybe just do presentations, have conversations with your colleagues, and start to change how people think. Don't plan to do all the work yourself, right? Think about how to build self-sustaining solutions and how to build natural champions throughout the organization for changes that you've made. If you take a team that's getting paged 2 or 3 times every night, and you can move them to getting paged once a week, they're going to be your best allies, right? Think about how to create those people. One thing to avoid is to try to sort of teach deep expertise to try to make new SREs a few people at a time, and then hope that they'll transmit it to their organization. It's not going to scale fast enough in hypergrowth, and those people aren't going to be rewarded for doing that work. Think about sort of small champions, people who see a problem and think, oh, I heard of these SLOs. I think they could solve this. And then they'll say that. And then their team will come to your SRE team for more detailed help or go look at the documentation, right? You don't want people who are experts at SLOs. You want people who think, I heard there was a solution to this, and now I know where to go looking for that solution. Think really incrementally, right? Big bang solutions are going to take forever to show value. And you'll probably get the needs of your organization wrong if you try to design a whole solution up front. So how do you build technology that improves the status quo in the quarter? or even a couple of days. For example, if you currently have people who are getting on-call shifts scheduled in ways that don't really respect their vacation or their personal lives in some way, building a tool that just goes and looks at your calendar and doesn't schedule you to be on call when you're already planning to be on vacation can make a huge cultural difference, because it starts to shift the impression of you need to be on call whenever we tell you to of course we'll arrange on-call around your life. There's plenty of people in the on-call rotation, or there should be, that we can do that, right? That can be a really big cultural shift, and it can only take a few days to make. And then finally, this is going to be a really long haul, so do celebrate your wins as you have them. Even those incremental wins, especially those incremental wins, can be really hard to see if you don't celebrate them as a team. So think about the fact that you've just asked a team of people, who are probably engineers, to do a lot of talking to other humans and convincing them to do things and building processes and seeing long, slow cultural change. And if you don't take the time to make sure that those engineers hear that those are good things that they're doing and those are valuable things that they're doing, engineers are not going to like that. All right, so I want to talk a little bit more about SRE. I've said this word a lot. I'm going to assume that most people in here know what SRE is, but you may not have actually heard it defined this way. So when you really think about SRE, what is SRE? What's the selling point of SRE? It's this really important goal and philosophy. Our operational costs, like the number of pages or bugs, probably our cloud resources, the number of people we need to run a service, should scale sublinearly with our number of customers or our dollars of revenue. And SRE is a set of tools to get there using software and systems engineering. That's the really important thing to take away about SRE. Now, obviously, there's a book, right? I think it's really important, if you're aware of the SRE book, if you've read the SRE book, to keep in mind that this was a book written by many, many teams at a very large company. No team who contributed to this book followed every practice in the book. No team did that, right? But this is Google's idea of the best of SRE. If you could build a team that did all of these things, in theory, it would be a great SRE team. So you can treat it as a set of descriptions of some tools you might find useful, and collectively as like a perfect goal. But it's not do all these things and you'll have a solution to your problem, right? This is what a North Star can look like if you could do everything, if you had infinite resources. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these SRE tools. There's more in the book, there's a lot in the book, but I want to emphasize that you don't want to think about this as dogma. Do not use the tools because they're there. Use them because they solve a problem that you have. Again, I've said SLOs, service level objectives. You've probably heard of those. Somebody's probably told you they're a good thing. Have you thought about what problem you're solving with them? Because saying that 99.9% of all calls to a service need to succeed or you halt development doesn't fix anything, right? It just adds a process, it adds a rule, it adds some bureaucracy. So what if we take a step back and say what problems we might want to solve? Well, you could use an SLO to condense a bunch of really complex features that might be in all kinds of different states into a simpler piece of information. Instead of saying, how well is the product working, or is the product working well enough, which is a really hard question to answer, you can ask, are we within SLO? And that's a proxy that you can define ahead of time for whether your products are working well enough for your customers to be satisfied. That's one use case for an SLO, right? And in fact, I would actually use that as the question that I use to figure out what my SLOs should be. Not how many nines should we have, but when do our customers get out the pitchforks? That's probably our SLO. You can also use SLOs for a bunch of other things. You can use them to establish internal API boundaries between your teams. As a client team, I can have a clear written statement about how often I can expect my dependencies to fail, and disputes about whose fault an issue is are simplified to asking, was the service an SLO or not? And we may have to then have a conversation about whether the SLO is the right one, if it's realistic. But instead of, well, you failed, well, you should have handled that failure, you, again, have pre-negotiated this as a boundary between these teams, right? You can use an SLO to do that. SLOs can help you establish that some low level of failure is normal and isn't worth the engineering time or hardware and cloud resources to try and eliminate. That's what an error budget is about, right? Some low level of continual failure is normal. That's what an SLO says. which of those reasons you have for wanting SLOs, and it could be more than one of them at once, should influence how you communicate about them and how you roll them out to your organization. Don't go to an organization that's been chugging along just fine and say, everyone needs SLOs now. What problem are you solving? What can't you do because you don't have SLOs? Focus on that problem, and you'll get SLOs out of them. And if the reason you want them is because they're in the book, I suggest you spend your time on something more valuable. Right, again, briefly going through some of these other ones, incident reviews and postmortems help you solve problems where you have the same thing happening over and over again. You see the same outage over and over again. They can also help you communicate. They can help teams explain to each other how their systems work and help people on board. Automation fixes a lot of that expectation that manual human work is what you spend a lot of your time doing. It also accounts for the fact that you might be asking your engineers to be very careful. So if you, for example, ask your engineers to check 4 or 5 different things before they roll out a release to production, that sure sounds like a job for a robot to me, right? Rather than something that you should be spending human time on, because humans are bad at that. It's boring. I don't do that. I hate checklists. Observability is also really important here, right? Some of these are scary changes to make. Especially with automation. Maybe you're just not confident that your automation is working well. Maybe you're not confident that you are really within SLO or that you're finding all of your incidents. How can you use your observability tools to make that, to build that confidence? You can also think about observability in terms of tracking down bugs, things that are annoying you. You can think about it as, where are the places that we're not scaling sublinearly? Let's go find those, let's address those in terms of both human cost and in terms of cloud costs. So very briefly, add the tools because they solve a problem for you, not because they're in the book. And as a parting thought, I want to emphasize again that no company that's still alive, no company that's still around, has truly finished this transition, is without any technical debt. There's always something that could be better. There's always an organizational problem to solve or a technical problem to solve, something that could be more efficient, and basically job security. And with that, I'll leave it out to questions.
Awesome. So does anyone have questions? I can walk around with the mic. We have one I can throw at you if you'd rather me throw a mic at you. We can do that too. Or I've got a couple I can kick off if everyone's feeling kind of shy. Anybody? Oh, we got one right here. Cool.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. I have a question about incentives, which is to say, like when an SRE or like the first SRE or the first SRE team gets created at a company, the incentive structure for the company and to all the engineering teams has been, hey, ship, right? But now you're sort of changing the incentive structure. How do you go about doing that, right? Because I can go to the engineers and say, like, I want you to get paid less. I think that's a reasonable thing. But to them, like, they still have to ship because that is still how they get rewarded, how they get promoted.
Yeah, so I think that this depends on what level of management buy-in you have for establishing an SRE team and what level of management buy-in you have for there being a problem. At a very, we don't have a lot of buy-in. One thing you can do is just hire engineers who are incentivized by making other people's lives better for a while and try to make that change from the bottom up, right? Be able to show that this team is adding value to the company even if they're not shipping things. And frankly, kind of take on an SRE team debt, right? To say, we're gonna try this thing, we're gonna reward our engineers with the fact that they've made people's lives better, and over time, we're gonna convince upper management that this is actually a valuable thing to do. So that would be how I would do it if I was trying to do it bottom up. If you're doing it top down, right? If you have an executive team that really believes that this is that they need to be making this more enterprisey transition, it's really simple. You just incentivize people around reliability, right? And don't incentivize people around sort of cheaply measured reliability. MTTR is a very bad metric. Number of outages declared is a very bad metric, so you're gonna have to think about exactly what you mean around reliability. But you can be thinking about, repeat outages or things ticked off around problems that you have or chaos tests that failed that now succeed, right? You can think about how you can measure reliability in a way that doesn't generate bad incentives, and you can reward a team for that. And what you would then do is use the language of reliability is one of the features that we ship, right? It's still a feature, right? If you don't have reliability, your customers don't care what your other features are, and you can think about it as a feature that you ship.
All right, any other questions? We got one in the back, perfect. I'm gonna throw this thing to you, is that cool?
I haven't played baseball in 20 years. Thank you again for the presentation. So at the place I work at today, one of the things we're trying to do is shift one team being always on call and figuring out how to distribute it out to the other engineering teams. You can imagine the other engineering teams don't want to be part of that transition because now it means they have to take the pages versus the couple of engineers that are on 24/7 on call. So I'd just be curious, like, what have you seen in your experience with helping to create that transition, ideally from like a bottom-up perspective, if that's even possible to get people to want to be part of it versus shy away from it?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously somewhat easier top-down because if you're doing it top-down, then you could, for example, pay people to be on call, or you can just mandate that they have to do it, neither of which is totally optimal, but there's some options from a top-down perspective. If you're trying to do it bottom-up, if you're trying to get people excited about being on call in a bottom-up way, you really have to get them invested in whether things are working in production. Again, sort of depending on the culture that you're dealing with to start with, one thing that I would consider doing is taking the on-call team that you have and having them sit down with engineers on the teams that you want to move into being on call with their services and talking through interesting pages that they've had for that service and just making it a cool engineering puzzle. How do you debug those things? How do you think through them? I think it's also really, really important that you convey to engineers that they will be empowered as part of being on call. And when I say empowered, what I mean is that they will have lots and lots of ways to make sure that if their pager load goes up, they get time to pay it back down, right? That they're not going to be expected to sort of get on a treadmill that speeds up over time around their on-call. And so how do you make sure that you've built those processes into teams of some level of review? You know, you're never on call more than a certain amount. If you're getting paged more than this amount, then we're gonna make some time in your OKRs or your project planning or whatever it is that you do to actually reduce the number of pages that you're getting. And you make sure that the team really hears that and really gets that message that that what they're getting out of on-call is cool engineering puzzles and empowerment rather than getting woken up at 3 in the morning.
Thank you for the presentation. It's been a really awesome thing to watch. I have a quick question with regards to, you were talking about tech debt and building and starting small and scaling up. A lot of that tech debt invariably is going to involve costs that the business is going to have to allocate and figure out, is it worth the company's time and money to invest in that infrastructure, or why bother? We're going to burn the SRE time and continually fix the problem and not spend extra money on it because we'll think about getting rid of it in 3 or 4 years down the line. Do you have any tips or tricks or suggestions to try and promote the worthwhileness of that investiture, either to the PMs or the other stakeholders within the company, and if it's metrics driven or anything that you can think of from that level?
Yeah, so once again, it sort of depends on what arguments people in your local environment find convincing. If it's a metrics trick, right, this is actually pretty easy to measure. What you do is you look at the gap that teams are having between their promised work in a quarter or whatever planning horizon you use and the work that they're actually delivering, and how much of that gap is explained by operational work or unexpected migration costs or the fact that they spent a lot longer fighting with a piece of infrastructure than they expected to. You can do that somewhat qualitatively, right? You can go take those surveys with teams. Depending on what kinds of work tracking you have, you might be able to do that somewhat more quantitatively. But you find those places where tech debt is keeping you from shipping, right? Where that interest on the tech debt is costly. And then you say what your project plan is to fix that thing, whatever that specific thing is, or any given thing. And you say, well, here's what we're paying quarter over quarter in our interest payments. And here's the capital investment that I'm talking about. What's the right trade-off here? One thing that I try to do when I'm making that kind of case to management is I try to remember that it's really not my job to say which one is the right thing. It's my job to make that case and make sure that they have real, accurate assessments in front of them. And if management really does want to just keep paying that interest, even though it seems like a real bad idea, well, that is technically their call. That's what management is for. So that would be how I would sort of look at metrics. The other thing that I have found fairly effective is to sort of nibble around the edges at some of these things. So rather than necessarily trying to solve some of those big problems, you can start to give yourself a little bit of breathing room with some much simpler things. So a really good example of this is if you have teams that are trying to do development work while they're on call, suggest that they plan that the person who's on call is just not available to do development work to make their planning more consistent and more reliable. And when that person's on call and they haven't gotten an active page, they go put some time into some kind of reliability work or some kind of automation or operations pay down, right? And that's a very small change that you can make. You can sell it to everyone as actually adding to the predictability of the process. You can sell it to everyone as not really costing us more, and still get some pretty substantial improvements out of it. So that would be sort of a way that I might go about it bottom up. Again, it's what arguments are convincing to the people around you. Certainly there are organizations where we want to build this cool new thing is going to get you a lot of people behind it. And so that might be a thing that you can do. I said this earlier with establishing credibility, but a lot of it is about having some successes under your belt so that when you go to management and you say, hey, I think we're spending a lot of costly energy on this thing, I want to take on this fairly substantial project to try and fix it. They don't say, who the hell are you? They say, I see your track record of success and would like to give you resources because I believe you can accomplish that.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I think we've got time maybe for one more question if somebody has one. Oh, I see a hand up front.
So I think a lot of what you talked about was kind of pushing like process and culture from kind of an individual contributor standpoint. And I think a lot of what you said made sense. What I'm wondering is how, in the lack of kind of support from upper management, would you drive a situation where there's maybe no culture to like developing culture, especially in like a remote environment?
I would go to a lot of happy hours. Genuinely. I would establish a lot of one-on-one relationships with people, and I would encourage my team and my management to do more establishing one-on-one relationships with people, and take the time in those conversations to just talk about work and talk about how you want to drive things in that direction. What you really want to sort of think about is what are my cultural forums, right? If the culture is developing, if it's a remote environment and people haven't sort of worked that out, how do you get people in the same room to talk to each other? Maybe the first thing that you have to do is build some framework for doing that. Maybe you need brown bag talks or a demos session or, in fact, a bunch of happy hours, right? But make a forum for that and then use that forum in order to present cultural ideas. My personal experience is that when you present engineers with ideas that are things like, your job should be easier, you should get paged less, you should not have to work so hard with the really irritating parts of infrastructure. It's very easy to sell that message to engineers, and so part of what you need is just a forum to tell them that, and to start to make that case and to start to give them the tools that they can use to make that go forward. So establish an onboarding class that you bring people to, or establish a regular tech talk and sort of seed it with people that you want to be the people who are founding that culture. And to a really substantial extent, like the way that you build a culture is with one-on-one conversations, especially when you're remote. Take the time to meet a stranger once a week and just have a 30-minute conversation over Zoom. Those can pay off in ways that you really don't expect. And even though it feels like a lot of time, if you were working in an office, you do that over coffee. It's not really more time than you're normally spending. It just happens to show up on your calendar. So that's sort of my answer is that set of things.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was awesome. Super cool hearing about that. Big round of applause.